We proceed with our next speaker, Professor Una Popovic. The title of her paper, Language of Heidegger's Philosophy, How to Think Despite the Words.
Dear colleagues, dear friends, let me start by saying how nice it is to be here in Athens today, and just to show some gratitude to our host and to our dear friend Evangelos, who invited us here and started this collaboration, which I hope is only the first step of many other to come. The main topic of my address to you today is Martin Heidegger and his philosophy of language. I would like to stress the possibility of understanding Heidegger in terms of being proactive or active philosopher, not just a theorist, but a philosopher who thinks in action, to be literal about it. It is to say that Heidegger's philosophy is to be understood in terms of performative, not just constative, in terms of John Austin's differentiation. Okay? Okay? This is okay now? In terms of British philosopher Austin's differentiation between the performative acts, speech acts, and the constative acts. That is to say that the language could be understood in two ways. One would be the one we are used to in the history of philosophy, in the philosophy in any theory as such, the use of language in terms of citations, in terms of sentences who do have meanings and through which we would like to share some kind of meaning with other people. The other one, performative ones, would be the kind of thinking, but in the same time acting with words. That is to say that words could act, could do something, and that we could also do something with words. This is the way I would like to stress that Heidegger is an active thinker. He's a thinker who is better to be understood in terms of performative acts than the theoretical ones, the constative ones, the ones the tradition of philosophy uses. That is to say that Heidegger's philosophy is, in terms of history of philosophy, something new, and that he wants to do something with his words, not just to transfer some kind of teaching, some kind of learning, some kind of philosophical attitude or stance, but to invite us to do something with him. This is, of course, also to say that Heidegger implies a kind of reaction to the traditional way of thinking about philosophy as a mere theory, as a sort of distance from reality, as a sort of stance that would just merely contemplate on it and make some kind of assumption of its structure or character or some kind of value, attitudes also, but he would like to say that philosophy should be something else, that it is in its essence something else, something that can change the world literally, and that we could use philosophy in this point to reevaluate our own position in our current state of affairs, in our current times. This kind of thinking in Heidegger is closely seen and most evident if we look on his philosophy of language. And we should make a distinction between the two positions of philosophy of language with Heidegger. One would be the literal one, Heidegger's philosophy of language as it could be found in many of his works, in many of his passages, in many of his lessons. This would be the usual kind of reflecting on language by philosophers. We can find some definitions of language, we can find some differentiation between language and thought, language and words, language and thinking and mind, and so on. But there is also another kind of seeing Heidegger's philosophy of language that would be the one that would show us how Heidegger uses language. That would be the one that would show us how is it that he can be active as a theorist, as a philosopher, and he can be active through language and through words. This is why I would like to show in some few words, because this is a man's topic, how did he thought of it and how did he want to manage such a thing? How did he want to do things with words, to say it differently? The most important thing that should be in front of this should be seen here is the fact that Heidegger wants to make a change in the way we understand philosophy today or in his time. He would plead for another kind of philosophy, as I already said. He would plead for a new way of thinking. He would plead for the second beginning of philosophy, and so on. He's very explicit about it. In his later thought, he even abandons the very term of philosophy, and he chooses another term, the term of thinking, Denken, as the right one. This kind of change should suggest us and should mark that this is not the usual, the ordinary way we understand what philosophy is. This kind of language change should make explicit in his own words that this is not philosophy anymore, at least that this is not philosophy in the way we used to think about what philosophy is, at least that we should rethink what this new name for philosophy, that is thinking, should assign, should mean. This kind of play with words and with language is explicit also in many other cases, and Heidegger is notorious for his use or misuse of language. He was often criticized for not being precise, for not using the usual, the regular, the familiar concepts of philosophy, for some kind of mysticism. He was criticized for some kind of poetic influences with philosophy and his use of words. He was criticized for his etymologies which he used in a specific manner when he interpreted philosophers of the past. All in all, he was notorious for his use or misuse of language. The main critique here stands for the unusualness of his use of language. The main problem with this is that Heidegger does not act with language. He does not use the language in the way we should expect and we would like to see. The most prominent problem of his use or misuse of language in these terms was the problem of argumentation, because the way he uses words cannot be read or seen or understood in the way we used to or we are used to make an argument in philosophy. This implies that probably Heidegger did not want to make a strong argumentation in philosophy, or perhaps he wanted to replace the old logic of thinking with some kind of associative thinking, which would more suit to poetics. For example, to name just one of them, when Heidegger says the language is the house of being, this sentence has the usual form. The language, something we would like to explain, is something else. We're explaining it by referring to something else. But the word he uses, the house of being, should not be there. Nobody knows what does this mean. Or nobody knows it on the first reading. Or we are disrupted, because this is not the usual way. This is not the usual word. What does house of being means at all in terms of philosophy, in terms of connection with the concept of being as such? This is something Heidegger wants to do. He wants to make this kind of disruption in the meaning, in the reading, in the way we understand the language, and at the first stance, in the way we relate to what is written and what is said. He would like to make you think, what is this? And he would like to make you think, why is this so? Because he wants to make this kind of rupture, this kind of distance from the ordinary way of thinking in order to invite you to think about philosophy or in philosophy in another way. The simple disturbance, the simple Entfremdung of the words in philosophy is something to be considered here, because his use or misuse or the unusual use of words in philosophy in making a new terminology, a new language of philosophy, is something to be considered as, and it is something to be noticed. He wants this kind of disruption because he wants us to be in a position to be fully concentrated on what he wants to translate or what he wants to say to us. This is because he's convinced that we are in advance in a position to be burdened by many attitudes that we inherited from the tradition of philosophy. And if we would like to invite us to a new kind of philosophy, to a new method of thinking, to a new stance in philosophy, he would like us at least not to mislead his guides or not to misunderstand what he wants to say, at the least. At the most, he would like us to think with him within this new way and in this new manner. Therefore, he's very prone to make such strange choices within words, within philosophy, as we already seen. For example, if he invites us to think in a new way in philosophy, this would mean, at the first stance, that this new way of thinking would bring us some new philosophical phenomena that were not seen before in philosophy. If it stands so, then he's invited, or we are invited with him together, to find some new words, another phrase, some new expression to express such new phenomena. But in the other case, when there are old phenomena, the phenomena philosophy is already familiar with, and if we are to think about these phenomena in a new manner, then we are also invited to change our language. We are also invited to make something new of these old words which we use to sign or to name the old phenomena philosophy is used to. So in those cases, he would refract the old terminology. He would analyze the old terminology. He would make unusual uses of the old terminology. For example, I think the most prominent example would be the concept of essence, which he uses often, but in very, very unusual ways. So he's trying to make things difficult for us, but this is not at all something that comes within his whim. This is not something that is contingent to his philosophy. This is a very strict and very methodological stance of his, which is related to and refers to his understanding of what philosophy is. He would, that is my thesis, would like to say that this kind of use of language in philosophy is more strict and more argumentative than the other ones that we are used to, than the logical ones, than the usual philosophical traditional ones. He would like to use the language, this is one more point I wanted to make today, to invite us to be in kind of position of cooperation with him. Because to say that Heidegger is a performative thinker and to suggest that his use of language in philosophy is making the language of philosophy such he did is something to be considered as a kind of thought in action or action in thought, is to say that this kind of language is not the usual language and that we are, as his readers, as his listeners perhaps, as his students for once, we are invited to think and to act with him. That would say that it is not enough for him only as an author to make this kind of change, to make this kind of unusual use of words. That is to say that we as his readers, as his interpreters, as his students, are also invited to do the same and to understand this concept in order to make them active. It is to say that Heidegger himself as a thinker cannot be just as him all alone, as him as a subject. He cannot be the only one responsible for the action of his thought. This action should be transferred to us, his readers and his interpreters, and we together, put together, his readers and him as such, we all together should make this possible and should make this active. The way he does it is by making the change in the understanding of language. He abandons the usual mentalistic paradigm of language, which divides the concepts from words, which divides the meaning as something that belongs to mind and to thoughts, from words who are merely signs, who are merely something that could be listened to or can be read, could be a piece of writing on a paper. And he doesn't want to make this subject-object gap anymore. That is to say that his concepts do not function anymore as a sign. They do not have any kind of significant relationship toward the things they are talking about. They are not names, they are not signs, they do not refer to any kind of objects. They are formal indications. That is to say that Heidegger's language and his use of words inaugurates another way of thinking about the concept in philosophy, the one that refers but does not refer to objects, but it does refer to thoughts and to the way of thinking. Those concepts are methodological ones. Therefore, if we are to understand those concepts and those words and those sentences and his theory, we are to think with him. If we read him in the usual way, if we treat his words as signs, we will be left with confusion. If we are to understand what he wanted to say, if we are to understand those kind of indications, we have to think with him, and that means to act with him. To conclude, this means, in broader terms, that Heidegger invites us to think together and to be active together as thinkers, that philosophy is not anymore any kind of mere formal stance or academic position, that it is always in front open to another people, and it is always a kind of collaboration that invokes us to be active together. Thank you so much.